Namaste, sir. Sir, I read both of your books very thoroughly and I was able to obliterate my colonial consciousness. Thank you for that. Sir, in your second book, you wrote that the impact of Western education on the Hindus as well as the Muslims was quite different. The Hindus got more detached from their culture and they got taken up in this English elite environment, taking up positions in the colonial administration, and became what Thomas Macaulay called as Indians in color and blood, but English in tastes, opinions, and intellect. While on the other side, Muslims, they retreated back to their traditional Islamic practices. Sir, what explains this different approaches or different responses to the European coloniality?
So there are two ways of looking at it, or rather two examples. The way Hindus look at Raja Ram Mohan Roy is the way Muslims look at Syed Ahmad Ali Khan of Aligarh. Okay. Now, Syed Ahmad Khan's entire goal was to learn English and to expose his community to Muslim education so that they could become part of state power without giving up their origins. Remember, Syed Ahmad Khan was a self-confessed Wahhabi himself because he's a product of the Dehlavi school of thought. He is actually a student of the very same seminary. I've explained this in the book. So his entire approach was, सीखो, उसमें डूब मत जाओ, क्योंकि तुम्हें इस सिस्टम को वापस लेना है. Whereas Hindus, if you look at Ambika Charan Majumdar's book, which I've cited, he was, I think, the president of the Congress around the 1915-16. This gentleman's book on the evolution of Indian political movement is a go-to reference. And he opens the book by a deification of Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Raja Ram Mohan Roy effectively believed that everything that was of consequence to Hindus from an education perspective was of no consequence, and that the only way that they could uplift themselves was by exposing themselves to Western education. So the clear distinction is, one chooses to learn Western education only to be able to navigate that particular system so that he can take back that particular system. And the other embraces Western education because he believes that his own culture has no value and his own educational systems has no value, and therefore in order for him to be at par with everybody else in the rest of the world, he needs to give up his past and adopt Western education, which explains even his reconception of Hinduism on Christian lines. The way he saw the Brahmo system or whatever it is was primarily through a Christian framework. So the difference between the Hindu approach and the Muslim approach is, the Muslim approach has been to keep its traditional systems alive, either through its seminaries, and even the most vocal of its reformists constantly spoke of keeping both identities alive and giving primacy to Islamic identity first. If Jinnah considered Aligarh Muslim University as the Muslim arsenal of Bharat, which would lead to the creation of Pakistan, and if he thought Aligarh was actually a great benchmark, Jamia was established because they believed that Aligarh itself was pro-British. Imagine an institution which you associate with the Pakistan movement being seen as more pro-British, and as a consequence Jamia is set up. Therefore, there is a very clear strain of conservatism as far as the Muslim thought is concerned, which has kept its consciousness alive and its collective memory alive for generations together. Here, Tilak was branded orthodox, and he was effectively called a Brahmin fascist by his own contemporaries. When the man singularly understood that the only way that you can actually fight the other side is by getting into the system without giving up your roots. Ultimately, the Swaraj Party was set up only on these lines. That's my answer to the question.
Thank you, sir.
So, in response to what you said, the Hindu society or the Hindu community responded to English education in the way it did because I think it was already colonialized, right? It had already been subjugated psychologically and culturally. So, what do you have to say about that? Like the Middle Eastern coloniality. it is still present. In 1946, B.R. Ambedkar published this book in before partition.
Pakistan partition, India, right?
Actually make a case for partition. So in that book, probably on the page 46 or 7, he has said that there are only two ways in which the minority problem of India can be. The first one is to partition India and transfer population. And the second one is by subjugating, the same way as Muslims or British did with the Hindus, to subjugate Muslims culturally and psychologically and to render them devoid of their sense of separate identity. Is there a third way? Is there a third alternative? Because I think the second one is too implausible and the first one has already been tried and actually goes against the Sanatan principles.
Right. So the first solution, we are now looking at the implementation of the first solution after 75 years. Do you think it's been a success? No. Okay. So the partition of this country, in the hope that we would be able to live in peace, has proved to be an utter failure. Now, because even that solution was not implemented in the manner that he wanted to, right? Which is the population exchange. The second thing is, it goes back to the root concept. अगर ये आपकी पुण्य भूमि है, then the question of partition can never be on the table. That's one. You are not fighting for the Himalayas exclusively for geonational security or water security or whatever it is. Himalayas are the spiritual epicenter for Sanatana Dharma. And when you have already given Sindh, you have already given those portions which are associated with the Vedic period. Gradually, those territories which are associated with your, let's say, history are being colonized from both sides. Which means effectively tomorrow you will read of these, let's say, these landscapes only as part of your mantras or as part of your practice, but in reality it's out of your hand. So a few days ago when I was talking to someone who was fairly senior and who understands how these things work, the gradual attempt has been to completely colonize northern parts of Bharat, especially the Punjab region and the Himalayan region, so that your Hindu identity is completely eviscerated. Imagine someone going to the Kailash Mansarovar and planting the red flag of the communist. For me, that's harakiri, that's sacrilege, that's blasphemy out and out. That's exactly what is happening. 2, therefore, is the first solution the better solution? Well, the first solution could have worked if those voices which were asking for Hindu unity and Hindu assertion had been given a chance. They were branded the extremists, they were branded the let's say the revolutionaries, and they were marginalized completely. I've said this in a previous discussion, and in the book I've clearly pointed out that while the revolutionaries continued to carry on the battle against the British through their own resources, the society did not come forward to help them either with money or anything else, because they were not seen as the mainstream option. So if you were to ask me whether the Hindu society was already colonialized, it is my view that the minute of 1835, which led to the introduction of the English education, and the formation of the Congress party, or let's say the Congress as a platform in 1885, marked the most significant milestones of taking away the Kshatriya and the revolutionary spirit of Hindus. Because both of them were meant to first kill you culturally and then to take away your political independence. As a consequence, शास्त्र शास्त्र से ही आता है, और आपने एक बार शास्त्र को रिप्लेस कर दिया तो शस्त्र पकड़ने की जो हिम्मत है वो भी चली जाती है. When everybody wonders how do these people produce suicide bombers, he is still in touch with his roots. He is so confident of what he is doing, and he has been indoctrinated into it so much that you don't know if you have the ability to do any of these things. Forget even suicide bombers, I'm not even going on those lines. Do you have the ability to stop someone if he chooses to wield a knife right in front of you on religious lines on the streets? Your first, let's say, resort will be to run away from the place. When you say that Hindus were already colonialized, you have to realize one thing. The British took power from whom? The Marathas. After the Third Anglo-Maratha War of 1818, which was fought for Delhi. Plasi and Buxar were very small parts of the Bengal province at that point. the battles of, let's say, Plassey and Buxar did not immediately project them as an all-India power. They were still a small power because the Marathas were still great. Even after the 1761 war, they continued to have a lot of, let's say, territory under their control, thanks to who? Mahadji Scindia. The man single-handedly restored the Maratha glory. So considering that, I would believe that they went about it in a slightly smart fashion, which is after the defeat of the Marathas, the introduction of education within a period of 1817 to 1835 is less than 20 years, education was introduced. And allow me to say this, something that I'm bound to be hated for, is that the success of the British man was in the co-option of the elites of the Hindu society fully. It is the elites of the Hindu society who learnt English first, who gave up their traditional professions. And consequently, you gave the other side an opportunity to divide you from the rest of your community. And since you chose to associate yourself with the British identity, obviously you have also given the missionaries an opportunity to start harvesting souls from the rest of the communities. In stark contrast, the religious elites of the Muslims continued to be associated with their traditional institutions. That's why I constantly trace the trajectory of the Sayyids on the one hand in the Muslim community, the Brahmins and Kshatriyas of the Hindus on the other community. Now I'm bound to be accused of, let's say, anti-Brahmin bigotry. Sorry, this is not bigotry, this is a statement of fact. Because one of the reasons that the Muslim establishment was outside the scope of the British establishment was because of a conscious decision taken कि हम अंग्रेजी नहीं सीखेंगे and we will follow a policy of remaining aloof from the colonial establishment. The first major change to that came from Syed Amir Ali in Bengal, then followed by Syed Ahmad Khan. Even then they decided that we will give primacy to both forms of education and the goal will be to reclaim Muslim state power. I would like to see which article or constitution of the debate of the Congress effectively said that the goal of the Congress is to reclaim the Maratha state power or the Hindu state power. They never said this. Every time Lala Lajpat Rai or Aurobindo Ghosh were exhorting them to focus on Hindu unity, or even Tilak would say this, their statement was, हम हिंदू पार्टी नहीं हैं, हम सेक्युलर पार्टी हैं. आज के डेट में ये कौन कह रहा है, आप सोच लीजिए.
Sir, although it might seem contradictory in visualization, yet it is a fact that Indic culture has an infinite capacity to accommodate all kinds of ideologies, belief systems and religions, which might be antagonistic to many others who are particularly accustomed to a monoculture. So my question is the role of the state in this reclaiming of the civilizational ethos. So in the contemporary scenario, how enthusiastic or inclined is the state in pursuing this decolonial approach towards history, towards constitutionality or reform? And if at all it is undertaking some cultural renaissance, why it is being termed as being essentially nationalistic or hyper-nationalistic? And sir, whether fundamentally it is the duty of the state to reawaken or the society to do that? That's all.
See, as far as your question is concerned, perhaps there is a tendency that I would want to discourage. Stop asking the question, why are we being branded fascist, nationalist, hyper-nationalist? इस सवाल का कोई मतलब नहीं रहा. It is very clear that there is a very specific agenda behind imposing these labels, which is to shame you and to guilt you from reclaiming your roots. You should simply develop a thick skin, which is to say, I don't care for public opinion at this point of time or the so-called opinion of elites at this point, because they don't represent the public opinion. They represent the opinion of a particular group or a particular gang or a particular group of wine-tasting liberals, which I don't care for. Your focus should be slightly different. Your focus should be on building your positive narrative in terms of what you represent. अगर आपसे कोई सवाल करता है that if धार्मिक रिपब्लिक 2.0 were to be recrafted, ये दिखेगा कैसे? इस प्रश्न का आपके पास उत्तर है? We don't have. What would be the scope of fundamental rights in this constitution? What would be the scope of gender rights in this particular constitution? सबसे बड़ा डर इनका ये अभी इन्होंने बिठा दिया है कि अगर आप धार्मिक रिपब्लिक फिर से आएगा तो वर्णाश्रम धर्म फिर से आएगा, इसका मतलब दिल से जाति प्रथा फिर से आएगी. How do you respond to this? This or these are the kind of questions that you should be focusing on. Now in that, you cannot expect the state to be fully invested and as invested as you, because the state is a political entity. Therefore, its considerations are bound to be power oriented. The society's interest is bound to be more civilization oriented and survival oriented. So the lead must be taken by the society, which is why I've given this particular, let's say, movement as an example, that after the loss of Muslim state power represented by the Mughals, how the entire Muslim community chose to organize itself, led by its religious elites, to come out with at least 7 movements which entrenched the Islamic identity further and finally led to the creation of Pakistan. Pakistan was not created because the Muslim League was found. Muslim League was found because the society had already started moving in that particular direction, and then which ultimately led to the creation of Pakistan. So therefore, you have to start thinking of what is the root cause analysis. The root cause analysis always starts with the society. So a few days ago, someone said, can we immediately go about changing the constitution? I said, it's not a question of whether there's a legal barrier in changing the constitution. You have a huge perceptual and societal barrier in changing the constitution, because except for this group, how many in your own peers and in your own circles would you be able to convince that this constitution is needed for so and so reasons? You can leave the Muslims and Christians out of this particular discussion. Hindus के अंदर अगर आपने ये प्रश्न छेड़ दिया, कितने लोग इस पे सीधा जवाब देने के लिए तैयार होंगे? That is the difference. And therefore, if at all there are any takeaways that I would want people to walk with after they read the book, is political power and state power का होना जरूरी है, but it is merely a साधन or a माध्यम to a particular goal. And उस goal या उस destination का identification करेगा समाज. And that is only going to happen when you keep your institutions alive. And therefore your temples, your mathas, and every institution that keeps the societal identity alive gives you a sense of community. These are the institutions that effectively, let's say, translate to longevity in a collective memory, in civilizational memory. In Muslim League's conferences, the venue would be chosen based on specific Islamic invasions. Sindh was chosen for a specific reason, and they would start with a recital of Bin Qasim and say how a young teenager came and destroyed the Kafirs here. If he can do that, imagine how much 70 million Muslims can do. That's exactly their exhortation. Every time. Okay, simple example. Whether in Delhi or in other places, the Muslim League's conference would start with a recitation of verses from the Quran. Okay? Congress के history में ये कभी नहीं हुआ. कभी नहीं हुआ. It will start with a Jai Jaikar for the king or the queen and end with a Jai Jaikar for the king and the queen. If this is your origin, in terms of your so-called independence movement, fundamentally the Congress must be held responsible for altering the DNA of the society in a very negative way. And Congress एक organization नहीं है, पाकिस्तान की तरह ये भी एक सोच है, which moves like a spirit from body to body. तो कल कांग्रेस का रोल कोई और निभाएगा, आज कांग्रेस का रोल कोई और निभाएगा. You will see that as far as the movement is concerned, from 1905 onwards, जो पहले एक्सट्रीमिस्ट और नेशनलिस्ट थे, पावर में आते आते लिबरल्स बन गए, सेक्युलर बन गए. एंड मैं 1920 की बात कर रहा हूं. They moved. और जो चिल्ला रहे थे, अरे भाई आपने अपने जितने भी आदर्शों को छोड़ दिया है, चुप रहो, ये बहुत इनकन्वीनियंट सवाल है, चुप रहो तुम प्लीज, ये ऑर्गेनाइजेशन की बात है, पार्टी लॉयल्टी की बात है, चुप रहो तुम. और उनको दरकिनार कर दिया गया. So when you effectively sideline voices which are speaking for the civilization, and this seems to be a trend at least for more than a century now, गांधी को ब्लेम करके कोई फायदा नहीं है. ये डीएनए जो है कांग्रेस का गांधी के बहुत पहले से था. Gandhi entered the fray only 1916-17, not before that, not too much. Until then he was in South Africa. People said अच्छा लिखता है, अच्छा बोलता है, बस that's all. उससे ज्यादा उसको कोई भाव नहीं देता था. Nobody used to actually say, Acha, you come here, shout for South African Indians every once in a while and go back. That's it. This was the DNA much before him. खिलाफत के जितने भी resolutions release हुए थे before Gandhi became a force to reckon with in the Congress, you should read who were the ones to pass those resolutions. Gandhi can be blamed for giving a multiplier effect and for mainstreaming a particular thought, but the genesis did not start from him. Next.
So, just you mentioned about Gandhi. I guess very less people have noticed here that your picture is directly face to face to the man on the wall.
At the very least, we are at the opposite ends of the spectrum. Polar opposites. I have certain, let's say, points of view which overlap with his, but I don't need to draw inspiration from his opinions. I'd rather go back to Sri Aurobindo. I'd rather go back to Swami Vivekananda. I might even go back to Tilak. I'll go back to Lala Lajpat Rai, Bipin Chandrapal. On any of the issues where I find myself similar to Gandhi, I immediately say, कोई और example जल्दी दे दो. नहीं चाहिए. Because you see, at the end of the day, it's not a question of the position that a person holds on individual points of view. आपकी legacy किस चीज से जानी जाती है? What do people remember you for? I'm not sure people are going to remember him for, let's say, the kind of things that he said on Hindu Dharma against the West and all that. That's a different issue altogether. But finally, आपने रघुपति राजा उसको भी आपने बदल दिया. You changed even that. Everything was changed. हिंदी को हिंदुस्तानी कर दिया. शुद्ध हिंदी का कोई मतलब नामो निशान नहीं रहा. I am saying this as a man from the south. Why would I want corruption of this language further by an indigenous person? I don't. Other side is clearly fighting for Urdu on the basis that we don't want Sanskrit influences in Urdu. Why should I tolerate an Urdu influence in Hindi, bhai? So, a slight stinger and a pot shot at people who speak Hindi as the native language. Don't go about asking others to speak in Hindi before you ask yourself whether what you speak is actually Hindi. At the very least, you start doing that. Anybody who tries to, let's say, insert other words in Tamil would get a proper response. Saying not done, not permissible. We will find the appropriate word for a computer also in Tamil. In our newspapers, we don't transliterate. News को news बोल दिया लेकिन देवनागरी में बोल दिया. Computer को computer बोल दिया लेकिन देवनागरी में बोल दिया. इसको हिंदी थोड़ी बोलेंगे आप. That's the difference. So my suggestion would be, people will say, oh, he's asking for puritanism. The other side is very clear that they want purity of their way of life, their way of language. I'm merely saying, why are you being, let's say, such a wimp in asking for your positions?